There is a kind of heat that settles over a hillside vineyard in the first week of July and refuses to leave. And that was the heat that lay over Ruth Hartley's rows on the morning she walked out before 6 with a hoe in one hand and a cup of coffee going cold in the other, looking down the slope at vines that should have looked proud this time of year and instead looked strangled, because underneath every trellis wire, choking the base of every vine, a thick green tangle of foxtail and bindweed had taken hold since the last rain. And Ruth stood there a long moment, just looking at it the way a person looks at a problem they already know is bigger than one morning with a hoe. She had kept this vineyard alone for 3 years now, ever since her husband Walter had died out past the equipment shed on a Tuesday in October. And in that time, she had learned that a hillside full of Concord vines did not care whether the person tending it was tired, and the weeds especially did not care. They came back every June like they had an appointment. Down in the valley below her land ran a shallow creek that fed her neighbor's cattle pond, and Ruth had made up her mind a long time ago that no spray of hers was going into that water, not for weeds, not for anything, whatever it cost her. And so far it had cost her plenty of sweat and not much money, which she figured was a fair trade until a summer like this one came along and reminded her that sweat alone might not be enough. The Hartley Vineyard sold its grapes through the regional cooperative out of Fenwick Junction, and every September a buyer named Delbert Voss drove up from the co-op office to walk the rows before the harvest contracts were signed for the following year. And Delbert was not a cruel man, but he was a careful one, the kind who looked at a vineyard the way a banker looks at a ledger, and he had told Ruth more than once, kindly enough, that a woman running 40 acres of hillside grapes alone was doing something admirable and something risky in the same breath, and that the co-op could only keep buying from growers who kept their rows looking like growers who knew what they were doing. That summer Ruth's grandson Sam, 16 years old and visiting from town for the season while his parents sorted out a move, had been sent to help her, though so far his help had mostly taken the shape of standing at the end of a row with his arms crossed, embarrassed by almost everything about the place, the outhouse smell of the compost pile, the ancient truck that only started on the third try, and most of all his grandmother's habit of doing things the hard way when there was clearly an easier way sitting in a can at the farm supply store. He had said to her one evening, not unkindly, that everybody else just sprayed for weeds and got on with their lives. And Ruth had told him that everybody else did not have a creek running past their lower field into somebody's cattle water, and that being right was sometimes slower than being easy. The vineyard itself had been Walter's father's before it was Walter's. 40 acres of Concord vines set into a south-facing hillside back in the years right after the war, the rows running the long way across the slope so the water would not simply race downhill and take the topsoil with it every time a storm came through. And Ruth had learned the shape of that hillside the way she had learned the shape of her own hands. Which vines came into leaf first in April, which low corner by the creek stayed damp longest into June, which upper rows caught the worst of the wind off the ridge in October. She had married into grapes the way a person marries into a family, not choosing it exactly, but coming to belong to it all the same. And in 30 years of walking those rows beside Walter, she had absorbed 100 small habits of his without ever writing one of them down. The way he always checked the underside of a leaf before he checked the top. The way he never once in all those years let a hired sprayer near the lower field. Not because he distrusted chemicals outright, but because he had grown up watching his own father haul buckets from that same creek to water stock. And a man did not forget a thing like that. That first July after he died, Ruth had nearly let the co-op talk her into a standard herbicide contract just to keep the rows presentable and the workload manageable for one person alone, and she had gone so far as to have the paperwork sitting on her kitchen table for the better part of a week before she finally decided she could not sign it. Not with that creek running past her lower field into water another family's cattle drank from every day of the year, and she had torn the paperwork in half and gone back to the hoe instead. And every summer since had been some version of the same argument between what was easiest and what she could live with. It was around the middle of July when old Gus Pemberton stopped by, a farmer nearly 70 who had known Walter since they were boys and who still kept a few acres of grapes himself out past the county line. And Gus stood at the fence looking at Ruth's weed-choked rows with the particular squint of a man deciding whether to say something. And finally he said that his own father, back before the war, used to run a little flock of geese loose in the vine rows every summer, and that geese, unlike goats, or sheep, mostly left the vines alone and went after the grass and the broadleaf weeds instead, because vine leaves were tough and a little bitter to a goose's taste while young grass was sweet and easy. And that the only real trick to it, Gus said, was that you had to get the birds out of their well before the fruit started to color, because a goose that would ignore a vine leaf all summer would not think twice about a ripe, sweet grape. And more than one grower his father knew had learned that lesson the hard way, losing a whole low trellis of fruit to birds that would not leave once harvest got close. Ruth turned the idea over for a few days the way she turned over most ideas, writing notes in the back of an old feed ledger about which rows were worst, how much water the vines were losing to competition, how many days she figured she had before Delbert's early scouting visit in August, and before the grapes themselves would start to ripen past the point where Geese could be trusted near them. And Sam watched her do this with the particular impatience of a boy who wanted a decision made faster than his grandmother was willing to make it. And when she finally told him she was going to try a small flock of young geese in the lower rows first, just 8 birds to start, he laughed out loud, a real laugh, and asked her if she was planning to invite the neighbors over to watch the show, because as far as he was concerned this was the single strangest thing he had ever heard of a person doing to a vineyard. Ruth did not argue with him. She only said that she had watched her husband try plenty of things that looked strange before they looked smart, and that she intended to watch the geese for herself before she decided whether Sam was right to laugh. The birds arrived on a Thursday, half-grown and loud, and utterly unbothered by the boy's skepticism, and Ruth and Sam spent that first weekend building a simple portable fence out of stakes and mesh wire, low enough to move by hand, tall enough to keep the geese working one section of the lower rows at a time, instead of wandering the whole hillside at once. And Ruth kept the ledger going, walking the fenced rows every morning at first light the way she had once seen her mother-in-law do decades before with a different flock for a different reason, counting how much grass had been cropped down overnight, checking the base of every vine trunk for damage, watching whether the birds went for the trellis wire, the drip line, the young vine shoots, or left them be. What she found over those first 10 days was mostly good news. The geese moved through the grass and the low broadleaf weeds with real appetite, working the ground bare around the vine trunks in a way her hoe alone could never have kept pace with, and they left the tough, bitter vine leaves almost entirely untouched, exactly as Gus had said his father found decades before, though twice she caught a young gander stretching up toward a low cluster of green, unripe fruit and nipping at it out of simple curiosity more than hunger, which told her plainly enough that Gus's warning had not been exaggeration, and that whatever good the birds were doing now would turn into real damage the moment those green clusters started to soften and sweeten. That same stretch of July brought one of the hottest, driest spells the county had seen in years, 10 straight days with no rain at all, and the thermometer nailed to the high 90s every afternoon. And Ruth found herself running the irrigation line longer into the evening than she liked, worrying about the vines going into stress just when they needed to be putting everything they had into the fruit rather than fighting to stay alive. And she noticed something she had not expected, that the rows where the geese had already cleared the ground beneath the trellises seemed to be holding up better than the rows still choked with weeds, since the vines there no longer had to share what little water fell or ran through the drip line, with a tangle of grass roots competing for the same moisture. And she wrote that down in the ledger too, underlined twice, because it was the kind of thing a person could easily miss if they were not out there every morning looking. Sam, for his part, had stopped standing at the end of the row with his arms crossed sometime during that hot spell, mostly because his grandmother had put him to work hauling feed and water to the birds twice a day, and there was not much room left in his schedule for skepticism, and he found himself, almost against his will, starting to notice things too. The particular way a goose would stretch its neck toward a clump of foxtail and ignore the vine leaf hanging 2 inches above it, the way the ground under the trellis went from a green tangle to bare, dark soil in the space of about 4 days once a section of fence was moved onto it. And one evening, without quite meaning to, he told his grandmother that it was kind of strange watching something work exactly the way an old man at the fence had said it would, and Ruth only smiled and said that was usually how you could tell an old man knew what he was talking about. Delbert Voss came through on his early scouting visit in the first week of August, earlier than his usual September pass, because word had reached him, as word always did in a county that size, that Ruth Hartley had geese running loose in her vineyard. And when he stood at the edge of the lower rows and saw for himself 8 geese working the ground beneath the trellises, he did not bother to hide what he thought of it, telling Ruth plainly that he had seen careless growers lose entire blocks of fruit to birds that would not leave a vineyard alone once the sugar came up in the grapes, and that he could not in good conscience recommend the co-op renew a contract with a grower who seemed, in his words, to be experimenting on her own harvest. Sam stood off to one side during that conversation, and where a month earlier he might have agreed with every word out of the buyer's mouth, something in him had shifted after 10 days of counting cropped grass and clean vine trunks alongside his grandmother, and he found himself wanting to defend her, though he held his tongue and only watched. Ruth answered Delbert calmly, the way she answered most things, telling him that she had no intention of leaving the geese and past the point where they could do harm, that she had been tracking the ripening of every block on the hillside against the calendar since the day the birds arrived, and that the flock would be moved off the vine rows entirely and into the back pasture well before Verison began. The moment the clusters started turning from hard green to soft color, whether that satisfied him or not. Delbert left that day unconvinced but willing, for the moment, to wait and see, which Ruth understood was about as much patience as a co-op buyer with a ledger to answer to could be expected to offer a woman he considered to be taking an unnecessary risk with land she could not easily replace. The last 2 weeks of that stretch became a quiet kind of race against the calendar for Ruth and Sam both, the two of them walking the lower rows together every evening now, checking cluster by cluster for the first blush of color at the shoulder of the fruit, and on an evening in the middle of August, with the heat finally starting to break into cooler nights, Ruth found what she had been watching for. A scattering of berries on the earliest block, gone faintly rose at the edges, and she told Sam it was time, and the two of them spent the better part of 2 days herding 8 increasingly reluctant geese out of the vine rows and back through the gate into the pasture behind the barn, where they could keep eating grass to their heart's content without a single ripening grape anywhere in reach. It was not an easy 2 days. Geese that had spent a full month convinced that a particular stretch of hillside belonged to them did not care to be told otherwise, and more than once Sam ended up sitting flat in the dirt after a bird decided the gate was going the wrong direction, and Ruth laughed harder that week than she had and longer than she could remember, telling her grandson that this, too, was part of the job nobody mentioned when they talked about the romance of running a family vineyard. By the second evening, though, all 8 birds were settled behind the pasture fence, honking their complaints at the barn cats and showing no particular interest in anything beyond the fence line. And Ruth walked back down through the lower rows alone in the last of the light, running a hand along one clean vine trunk after another, and allowed herself, just for a moment, the kind of quiet satisfaction she generally tried not to indulge in too early in a season. What was left behind them, row after row, were vine trunks standing in clean, bare, weed-free ground for the first time in years, the vines themselves visibly less stressed than Ruth had seen them in a long while, putting their strength into fruit instead of losing water and nutrients to a tangle of grass and bindweed. And through the last weeks before harvest, she watched those clusters swell and color with a kind of quiet satisfaction she had not let herself feel too early, remembering that a summer could still turn on you with an early frost or a hailstorm right up until the fruit was actually in the crates. Delbert Voss came back for his proper harvest walk in the second week of September, arriving with the same careful, ledger-minded look on his face he always wore, clearly expecting to find, at best, a middling result and a lesson learned the hard way, and instead he found row after row of clean, healthy vines, heavy with even, well-formed clusters, not a single stripped or missing bunch anywhere on the lower block where the geese had worked that summer. And when Ruth walked him down past the pasture fence and showed him the flock, fat and unbothered, grazing well clear of any vine, he stood there for a while without saying much of anything at all, which for a man like Delbert Voss was its own kind of admission. He told her finally, in the plain, unshowy way he told most things, that he had seen a great many growers try a great many shortcuts over the years, and that most of them had not worked out nearly this well, and that he supposed the ground did not much care whether a person believed in a method or not. It simply showed you what it showed you. And what it was showing him that morning was a block of vines in better shape than half the rows he would walk that week. He signed the renewal that same afternoon, and for the first time added a small increase to the following year's contract instead of the reduction Ruth had half expected to be discussing back in July. And though he never said outright that he had been wrong to doubt her, he did not need to, because the vines had already said it for him. Sam left at the end of that summer a different boy than the one who had arrived embarrassed by an outhouse and an old truck, having spent his last week teaching a younger cousin visiting from town how to tell a weed from a young vine shoot, and explaining, with more confidence than he had any right to considering he had laughed at the whole idea 2 months earlier, exactly why his grandmother's geese would eat foxtail grass all day long and would not touch a vine leaf until the day the fruit turned sweet enough to tempt them, at which point he told his cousin proudly, "You had better already have them out of there." What Ruth Hartley proved that summer on her hillside was not some miracle cure for every weed problem a grower might face, and she would have been the first to say so, because she understood as well as anyone that a flock of geese left too long in a vineyard would do exactly the damage Delbert Voss had feared, that the whole method depended on watching the calendar and the color of the fruit as closely as she watched anything on that farm, and that a grower who was not willing to do that daily watching had no business trying it at all. Geese have in fact been used for generations in vineyards on more than one continent precisely because they graze selectively, favoring tender grass and broadleaf weeds over the tougher, more bitter foliage of a grapevine, which lets them clear the ground beneath the trellises without the labor of constant hand weeding and without a drop of herbicide anywhere near a hillside or the water running off it. But that same selective grazing habit turns against a grower the moment the fruit itself ripens, since a goose that has ignored sour green grapes all season will happily strip a vine of sweet, ripe ones in an afternoon, which is why every grower who has ever used the method successfully has treated the timing of removing the birds as the single most important decision of the whole season, not an afterthought. It is a narrow window, and a grower has to be watching closely enough to catch it. But for a woman with a creek she refused to poison and a hillside she meant to hand down in better shape than she found it, watching closely enough turned out to be exactly the kind of work she already knew how to do.